Do you think the most horrifying mummification traditions in human history belong to ancient Egypt? You're wrong. Just 150 years ago, in Victorian England, aristocrats mummified young girls and displayed them in their homes, and this was one of the best-kept secrets of the era. 19th century England, viewed from the outside, was a period dominated by strict moral values, etiquette, and social norms. In this society shaped under Queen Victoria's iron fist, even the slightest immorality could result in social ostracism. But beneath the surface, especially behind the walls of the wealthy and privileged class, a horrifying practice was taking place that historians still struggle to acknowledge today: decorative human mummies. The story began in 1840s London, in a luxurious mansion along the banks of the Thames River. Lord William Blackwood was one of the era's wealthiest and most influential aristocrats. He was known for his deep interest in Egyptian archaeology. He possessed a special collection full of ancient artifacts brought from Egypt. However, Lord Blackwood's most valuable piece was the mummy of a young girl, standing at the center of his guest room. This mummy, according to his claim, belonged to a pharaoh's daughter. At least once a month, Lord Blackwood invited his elite guests to his home to view this special collection. As guests gathered around the young girl's mummy, examining it with admiration, no one questioned its true origin, until one night when the careful eyes of a young doctor, Dr. James Richardson, noticed a small detail on the mummy's hand. On the little finger of the mummy's right hand was a ring of 19th century English craftsmanship. Dr. Richardson quietly noted this anomaly but made no comment that night. Instead, he embarked on an extensive investigation in the following days. He began examining missing person cases in London hospitals. After 2 weeks of intensive research, he came across records of a 16-year-old servant girl named Elizabeth Collins who had disappeared. 3 years earlier, Elizabeth had vanished. While working at Lord Blackwood's mansion, Dr. Richardson's suspicions were now confirmed, but he had no concrete evidence. Bringing accusations against one of England's most powerful families could mean the end of his career, and perhaps his life. The doctor intended to keep this terrible secret to himself and forget it. But as a twist of fate, London's famous anatomy professor Sir Henry Wellington's path crossed with Lord Blackwood's mansion. Sir Wellington had been invited to see the Egyptian collection. Like Dr. Richardson, he was a scientist specialized in mummification techniques. While examining the mummy shown by Lord Blackwood, he immediately noticed something was wrong. The professor, intimately familiar with ancient Egyptian mummification techniques, realized this mummy had been prepared using modern methods. Moreover, the mummy's facial features bore European characteristics rather than typical Egyptian ones. Professor Wellington managed to conceal his astonishment and asked Lord Blackwood where he had acquired this magnificent piece. The Lord explained that the mummy had been excavated from a tomb near Cairo and that he had paid a great fortune to bring it to England. Wellington politely nodded but knew internally that this story was completely fabricated. After leaving the mansion, the paths of Professor Wellington and Dr. Richardson crossed at the London Royal Medical Academy. The two scientists carried the same horrible suspicion independently. After a brief conversation, both were convinced that the mummy in Lord Blackwood's collection had actually been created in modern times. However, questions still remained to be answered. Who was this mummy, and how had it been created? The two scientists, taking risks, initiated a secret investigation. Dr. Richardson tried to reach Lord Blackwood's former servants. Most were afraid to speak, but an elderly gardener remembered that 3 years ago, lights had been on until late at night in the Lord's private laboratory, and strange chemical odors had emanated from there. Professor Wellington adopted a different approach. He began gathering information about mummification techniques in London's medical circles. Surprisingly, he learned that over the last decade, several anatomy experts had conducted secret experiments on modern mummification techniques. One of these experts, Dr. Theodore Morris, was a close friend of Lord Blackwood. When the two investigators Combine their findings, a horrifying picture emerged. Apparently, Lord Blackwood had mummified the missing servant girl Elizabeth Collins and added her to his collection as an ancient Egyptian piece. However, this was not an isolated case. As investigations deepened, at least a dozen suspicious ancient mummies were identified in the homes of London's wealthiest and most respectable families. Even more disturbing was that almost all of these mummies were of young girls. Most were servants, working-class girls, or street children between the ages of 15 and 20, people whom no one would search for if they disappeared. By selecting these vulnerable girls, the aristocrats had found easy victims and minimized the risk of being caught. How had this terrible trend begun? Archaeological expeditions to Egypt in the 1820s had sparked a great Egyptian mania in Europe. Ancient Egyptian artifacts, especially mummies, were of great interest among wealthy collectors. However, genuine ancient mummies were both extremely rare and sold at astronomical prices. This situation had encouraged some greedy and immoral aristocrats to create their own ancient pieces. After the Lord Blackwood case, Dr. Richardson and Professor Wellington decided to present their evidence to Scotland Yard. However, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. After examining the evidence, the police chief closed the file and advised the two scientists to forget the matter. Behind this reaction was the aristocracy's influence over the police. Wealthy and powerful families were applying all kinds of pressure to prevent this terrible secret from coming to light, but the facts could not be completely covered up. Towards the end of the 1850s, rumors about fake ancient mummies displayed in aristocrats' homes began circulating in London's underground press. Although these rumors failed to capture public attention, they formed one of the darkest secrets of Victorian London. Young girls from the lower classes were not the only victims of this mummification mania. In some cases, members of aristocratic families themselves shared this terrible fate. Especially aristocratic girls who died at a young age or had inappropriate relationships were removed from society by their families under the pretext of traveling to visit a distant relative, while in reality, they were secretly mummified. In 1862, the case of Lady Sarah Pembroke was one of the most striking examples of this horrible tradition. Lady Sarah, 19, had been caught trying to elope with a man her family disapproved of. A few weeks later, at a party held at her family's mansion, guests saw a magnificent statue of Lady Sarah. This work of art, reflecting the lady's perfect features, was nothing more than her mummified body. How was this mummification process carried out? Victorian-era mummification techniques were quite different from ancient Egyptian methods. With the development of modern chemical science, methods of preserving corpses had also evolved. Victims were generally first poisoned with a mixture containing high amounts of arsenic, which delayed decomposition after death. Then, the body was processed with special chemicals and internal organs were removed. Finally, the corpse was dried, polished, and given an artistic pose. One of the most horrifying aspects of this process was the possibility that some victims might still have been alive. When the mummification process began, historians and forensic experts suggest that the expressions of fear on the faces of some mummies provide evidence that the victims might have been conscious during the process. The Victorian-era mummification craze continued until the 1870s. There were several reasons for the end of this practice. First, more and more doctors and scientists were learning about this terrible secret and quietly opposing it. Second, some aristocratic families had begun to realize the moral and legal risks of this hobby. Finally, with more genuine Egyptian mummies being brought to Europe, the demand for fake mummies had decreased. This terrible tradition rarely appears in official history books. To avoid casting a shadow on the brilliant and noble image of Victorian England, most historians have chosen to ignore these events. However, traces of this dark practice are still present in secret archives and private diaries. Today, some of these mummies are kept in private collections or museum warehouses. Most are catalogued as anonymous 19th century anatomical models. The true story of these mummies has only recently begun to emerge with advances in forensic technology. Modern scanning techniques have detected 19th century arsenic residues and mummification chemicals inside these mummies. The brave research of Dr. Richardson and Professor Wellington had uncovered one of the darkest secrets of the era. Both scientists kept secret diaries to document this terrible truth. These diaries only emerged after their deaths, shedding light on this shocking tradition behind the scenes of Victorian England. The Victorian-era mummification craze is one of the most disturbing pages in human history. It is a striking example of how an apparently civilized and moral society could turn to horrific practices behind closed doors. This story also reveals the deep chasm between social strata and how power holders could abuse their power.